All right, so today we're going to be talking about the Russian Revolution. Now, I say revolution singular, it's actually plural. There's three of them, one in 1905 and then two in 1917. And then we're going to talk, or we're also going to focus on the consequences of this last one, the October Revolution of 1917. And then as we go through this, by the way, I want you to really be thinking of how this compares to the French Revolution. So we've got a really similar kind of basic narrative here. We've got this unequal society ruled by a poorly prepared monarch. People rise up, they have a revolution, they try and establish a democracy, they try and write a new constitution. But then this revolution gets hijacked by a bunch of radicals who rule using terror. So just keep in mind some of those similarities here. All right, so we got to do some contextualization here. Let's get caught up. So where are we? So at the turn of the 20th century, Russia was still pretty autocratic, pretty conservative, and pretty agrarian. So their economy is still really based on agriculture rather than industry, despite some of those reforms that were carried out by Tsar Alexander II, right? So remember, he's our Tsar liberator. He emancipated the serfs. He thought that would kind of set Russia up to industrialize. Helped a little bit, but remember the way he did that, right? Most peasants still aren't really able to leave their land because they're paying rent on it, right? And moreover, even though the serfs had been emancipated, Russia was still really not only economically, but also politically unequal. So the czar, the clergy, the aristocracy, they still held most of the political and economic power. The peasants didn't hold much. And even though, so Russia's kind of just barely starting to industrialize, they've got this tiny but growing middle and working class. They don't hold very much power either. So this is really, really similar to sort of France before the French Revolution. Again, that ancien regime thing. So we've got kind of like this very tiny middle class, some growing working classes in the cities, lots of peasants. None of them have any political power, right? But they want it. Now, again, Russia's kind of starting to take some steps towards industrialization. So Tsar Nicholas II, he's the one who's in charge by the time of World War I, by the time of the Russian Revolution. And his finance minister, this guy named Sergei Witte, he started to industrialize a little bit. He was real big into building railroads. So that was happening. That was good. But at the same time, Tsar Nicholas II was just really not interested in pursuing any political reform. He continued to repress the opposition. We saw that he was pretty anti-Semitic, so that's not good. So we've got kind of two groups in Russia who are really looking for political change, or at least two political factions. So we've got the liberals who want to establish like a republic, kind of like or at least a constitutional, actually they really wanted a constitutional monarchy. They're not full-on Republicans yet. And then we've got the socialists, right, who want some kind of government in which the workers and the peasants hold all the power, and that's just more economically equitable, right? Now, just a note as we go into this, so prior to 1918, Russia used the Julian calendar, and that's a few weeks behind the Gregorian calendar, which is what we use today, and which is what most of Western Europe used back then. So that's why some of the dates are kind of funky. So when I say the February/March Revolution, it's the same day. It's not like over the course of 2 months. It's just the date is different depending on which calendar you use. And it's the same thing with the October/November Revolution. So that one's October 26th in the old style, November 8th in the new style. It's the same date. It's not a 2-month thing. It's just calendar is different. So it's kind of funky. So just keep that in mind. All right. So let's talk first about the 1905 revolution. That's kind of the prequel. Now, in both the 1905 revolutions and the two 1917 revolutions, really one of the big inciting factors is going to be a really devastating participation in a war. So in 1905, it was the Russo-Japanese War. So in 1905, Russia went to war with Japan over sort of colonial interests in Korea. And as I kind of mentioned when I talked about Japan, we talked about new imperialism, Russia got their butt kicked. Japan was really, really good. Russia, not so much. The war, of course, that's getting beaten a war is not great for morale. We know that, right? But moreover, the war led to food shortages, and these hit peasants and workers really hard. And really what it showed is that even though Russia's starting to industrialize, those benefits aren't really going to the workers and the peasants, right? They're only going to the middle and upper classes. Now, how does this lead to revolution? So in 1905, so in January, workers lead a peaceful protest against the Tsar. And what happens? The army massacres the protesters. This one is actually not Tsar Nicholas's fault. He didn't know. He didn't say kill all the protesters. What happened was the army panicked. They didn't know what to do, and they just started shooting. But basically what happens is, people blame the Tsar, right? So this event is called Bloody Sunday. So that event, plus the loss of the Russo-Japanese War, plus the overall hardship imposed by the war, sparks the revolution of 1905. Now, this doesn't go anywhere. It's a failed revolution. Nicholas suppresses the revolution, but he does agree to some limited reforms. So he creates a parliament called the Duma, but the problem is the Duma didn't really have any power. They kind of just existed to kind of rubber stamp his legislation. And then Tsar Nicholas also tended to disband it when they weren't doing what he wanted, So that's not great. There were some agricultural or economic reforms. So Tsar Nicholas II's prime minister was a guy named Pyotr Stolypin. He kind of got rid of that situation where peasants were paying rent on their land. And he actually just said, peasants, okay, now you own the land. So that was good because it allowed the peasants a little bit more economic equality. So that was positive. Just as a side note, Stolypin also kind of helped suppress the revolution. He was known for hanging dissidents. So got a little carrot and stick going on there. All right, but the problem is these reforms were really short-lived. They didn't really solve any of the big underlying political and economic inequalities. So Russia kind of just chugs along for a little bit until World War I, which is really, again, that is the final blow to the monarchy. So as we mentioned, right, Russia does not do well in World War I. They get their butts real kicked by the Germans. And again, a lot of this is because Russia just isn't as industrialized as Germany at this point, right? So what does that lead to? There's just not great supplies. And then Tsar Nicholas II, again, complicates it because he's just not that great at war. So let's talk about the supplies first. So again, this is largely because Russian industry just can't keep up with war demand. So factories couldn't keep up with all the war materials they needed to produce. The rail network couldn't transport what limited supplies they had. This hit the soldiers really hard. So I hear stories about like soldiers not having boots and guns and stuff like that, which you need to fight a war. And then of course it hit the home front really hard too. So there was rationing, there was food shortages. And again, they hit the poor more so than they hit sort of the middle class and the wealthy. So just highlighting that economic inequality. Now, second factor here, right, is that Tsar Nicholas is just, he's already not popular, and his leadership choices during the war make him even less popular. So he actually leaves St. Petersburg, which is the capital, and he goes to the front personally because he feels like he needs to be there personally by himself for some reason. And he leaves the country in the hands of his wife, Tsarina Alexandra. And poor girl, she's also not popular, largely because, I mean, she's German, and they're having a war against the Germans. So poor thing is just set up to fail. And she also makes kind of a bad choice. You know, it's one of those things that probably wouldn't be a bad choice if she made it outside of this context, but she makes friends with this really creepy looking guy over here, Rasputin. The reason why she does, he's a monk. He's kind of like this mystic. Her son had hemophilia, which is this disorder where your blood doesn't clot properly, so it can be fatal. And she thought that Rasputin could heal him. But basically what happened was Rasputin kind of creeped everybody out, and it made her even less popular. And by extension, Tsar Nicholas II even less popular. So everyone's mad at the Tsar, everyone's mad at his wife, just not a good situation. So what this does, more so the economic hardship, actually, Rasputin, he gets a lot of credit for being really influential in the Russian Revolution, but he's really not. So, yeah, that's just my take. So yeah, my take is that it's really the economic inequality that leads to the revolution. So in February/March, again, it's the same day, different calendars. Basically, distrust in the government comes to a head, plus all this economic quality, the rising food prices, starvation. It leads a bunch of female textile workers to march on the capital, so at this time again St. Petersburg, and they demand food and freedom, right? Political equality. They want to be able to participate in the political system. They're joined by a bunch of working class men, and boom, Tsar Nicholas, he's like, oh my gosh, this is a revolution. I know how to deal with this. I shoot them. And so he orders his troops to fire on the protesters. This time it is his fault. But unlike in 1905, the soldiers refused to shoot, and they actually joined the protesters. Well, why is that, right? Well, the war is going so badly. They're suffering too, and they're like, we're just done. We want out of this war. So the Duma, right, again, that parliament, they announced they're taking control, and they established what's called the Provisional Government. And this is like this temporary sort of short-term liberal republic that's going to establish a constitutional assembly, so write a new constitution, for Russia to establish kind of a longer-term constitutional republic. Very similar again to what happened in France, right? We get this is kind of like that post-tennis court oath era, where we got this group, they come together like, all right, let's write a constitution. But it's this very fragile situation, really liable to be hijacked by radicals, which is exactly what happens. And by the way, that textile worker strike, that was on March 8th, which is International Women's Day. So that is where that came from. All right, so problems with the provisional government. I already kind of mentioned it, right? Well, first of all, they really only represent the interests of middle and upper class people, so they're dominated by these groups. Not a lot of workers represented, not a lot of soldiers represented, not a lot of peasants represented, right? So those people are like, well, who's going to meet our needs, right? Well, who does come to meet those needs? So the Provisional Government shares power with this a bunch of different kind of smaller governmental organizations called the Soviets. So the biggest of these is the St. Petersburg Soviet. By the way, during the war, St. Petersburg changed their name to Petrograd because everyone thought St. Petersburg sounded too German, so it was kind of a patriotic thing. So basically, the provisional government is sharing power with these councils made up of workers and soldiers. So that's who represents their interests, right? So we've got the situation in which there's kind of two governments vying for control of the same country. That's fragile, right? Now, the biggest problem with the provisional government is that they didn't want to withdraw Russia from the war. So like, we need to support our allies. We need to keep fighting this war. The soldiers, of course, are not happy with that at all, right? Workers not happy with that either, because they're the ones producing the munitions, right? Now, there's a problem with the Soviets too, right? So the Soviets actually are not controlled by like this unified political party. So there is a dominant faction, especially within the St. Petersburg Soviet, and they're called the Bolsheviks, and they are radical socialists. So they believe that socialism couldn't be accomplished in a liberal democracy. So they don't like the provisional government from the start because they don't think they can work with the provisional government. They want a full-on revolution. They want to control the government. So they are led by this guy named Vladimir Lenin. And a fun fact about Vladimir Lenin is that he really wanted to be Robespierre, and everyone was aware of it. So people compared him to Robespierre in his own lifetime. So yeah, so that's fun. Stay tuned for what he does. Now, we've also got this other faction in the Soviets who are kind of vying for control, and they're called the Mensheviks. They're also socialists, but they're more moderate socialists, and they're ready to work with the provisional government, right? They're like, I think we can establish some kind of, if we have a democracy, we can establish some kind of socialist policy here through reforms. They're okay with that. Third faction is socialist revolutionaries, or SRs, and they are kind of like, they represent the peasants' interests more so than the workers and the soldiers, and they're kind of the heirs to those people who threw bombs at Tsar Alexander II and killed him. So they're there. And I only really mention them because they get persecuted really hard later on. Now, one thing I want to mention, if it helps you remember, so again, that moderate radical socialist thing that we've got going on, it's actually really similar to two things we've seen in the past. So first of all, if you remember back from the French Revolution, we had the Montagnards, they were the radicals, and then we had the Girondins, they were the moderates, so that's there. And then these folks are also kind of similar to the Bolsheviks, are similar to the Communist Party over in Germany. These are kind of like the Social Democrats over in Germany. So we saw how that situation turned out. So they're not good, not friends. All right. So what happens next? So during the summer of 1917, the Bolsheviks kind of realized, they're like, you know what, this is our moment. We're going to seize power, but we need to build up support. So they work all summer to do that. Now, the Bolsheviks, they demand, basically, they're like, you know what, we want the Soviets to take control of the government. We don't want any kind of provisional government in charge here. And then they also have this slogan that really illustrates all the other things they wanted, which was peace, land, and bread. Very straightforward. You can imagine why people liked it. So peace, they want to get out of the war. Land, they want to redistribute land so it's more equitable. Bread, they want people to have food so they're not starving. Now, what's interesting about this, and what really actually helps the Bolsheviks, is that the leader of the Petrograd/St. Petersburg Soviet, he formerly was a Menshevik, and then he turns and he joins the Bolsheviks, and so that helps him out. And this is Trotsky, by the way. That's Lenin, that's the leader, that's the Robespierre type. And then Trotsky becomes Lenin's right-hand man, and then they work together to build support. So they work real well together. By default, Lenin and Trotsky are confident. They're like, it is our moment. We're going to seize power. And they do that. So a bunch of troops on the night of October 26th/November 8th, again, same date, they seize control of the government in the name of the Bolsheviks. And now the Bolsheviks are in charge. This is the October Revolution. All right, so what do the Bolsheviks do now that they're in charge? Well, first of all, it's actually going to take them a long time to kind of solidify their power, even though that initial revolution is pretty quick, but we'll talk about that next slide. So what do they do once they get in power? Well, they implement this really wide-ranging socialist policy. So they get rid of the Constituent Assembly. They're like, you know what, we're not doing this liberal democratic constitution thing. We're just going to rule the way we want to. They nationalize all of the land. So basically, nationalize means the government takes it and then redistributes it. So that's what the Bolsheviks do. They take it all and then they redistribute it to local land committees. So hopefully that'll make things a little bit more equitable. Doesn't really. They nationalize all the factories and then they turn them over to the workers. So again, they're like, all the land to the peasants, all the factories to the workers. Everyone's equal. Yay. Then what they do, as we mentioned, kind of when we talked about the consequences of World War I, they implement a bunch of policy that expands women's rights, because there are a lot of Bolshevik feminists, including Lenin's wife. That was kind of her thing. But we kind of mentioned that last time, so I won't go over that. And then the Bolsheviks also do the peace part of their slogan, right? They pull out of the war. So they negotiate the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. I didn't say it right. Brest-Litovsk. Brest-Litovsk Slate with Germany, and that withdraws them from the war. The problem is it's not a very well negotiated treaty. We could thank Trotsky for that one. And Russia loses a lot of territory. So they give up Finland, they give up the Baltic states, they give up Poland, and then they lose Ukraine too, which is kind of the quote unquote the breadbasket of the Russian Empire. So they lose a big food source. That's problematic. All right, so that's going on. The Bolsheviks are trying to establish all that policy, but at the same time, they're also trying to establish political control. So they do fight a civil war. So they face opposition from pretty much literally every side of the political spectrum. The Tsarists don't like them for obvious reasons. The liberals don't like them. The socialists, the other socialists, the Mensheviks and the SRs don't like them. And all of these opposition groups come together to form this military force called the White Army. Now, the Bolsheviks respond by forming their own army called the Red Army. Lenin gives that to Trotsky. He is giving Trotsky all the hot jobs. And if you're like, hey, wait a minute, so this guy joins at the last minute and then he gets all the good jobs, yeah, that's going to set him up for some problems, but we'll talk about that next unit. So the Russian Civil War lasts until 1921, so 1917 and 1921. And the Bolsheviks win. They do take over. They do establish a government that's going to last until 1991, if you're keeping track. Well, why is that? What advantages do the Bolsheviks have? Well, first of all, the big advantage that they had was that the whites just weren't that great. They were really disorganized. They were really poorly unified. You can imagine because you have literally like the entire political spectrum that isn't super far left. So they didn't really like each other. So that was a problem. Second thing the Bolsheviks had in their favor is that Trotsky was actually a pretty good military commander, surprisingly enough. He kind of knew his limits, and so he basically hired a bunch of officers who did know how to fight a war. And then he also used terror to keep those officers in line. So he did kidnap their family members. So that's one way to get things done. There's a lot more terror, by the way, in the Bolsheviks' future. We'll talk about in the next slide. And then another thing the Bolsheviks did is they implemented this policy called war communism. So basically what they did, we mentioned they've nationalized a lot of factories, they've nationalized a lot of land and then redistributed it, right? Well, what they do during war communism is they basically seize control of all the food, and then they put all the factories that they are in charge of, they put all those factories towards producing stuff for the war. So we mentioned total war is this idea that sort of like when your country is using all its resources to go towards the war, this is like total war. So because the Bolsheviks control pretty much all industry, they're able to redirect it all towards the war effort. So you can imagine that leads to some pretty drastic starvation among people who are not soldiers, but it does win the war. And then finally, the Bolsheviks also had nationalism on their side. So kind of like when we talked about the French Revolution, right? Right after the French Revolution happens, all these neighboring countries invade because they realize the long-term implications of this, if that revolution spreads. And then the French were able to rally all their people and push those folks out. Same thing happens during the Russian Revolution. There is some foreign intervention because everyone's like, yeah, I don't want this communist revolution to spread. You can imagine the Germans are real scared of that. And so they do send troops, and the Bolsheviks do use nationalism to rally all these folks against that foreign intervention. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is I kind of alluded to it earlier. The Bolsheviks did use terror to win. And that's going to lay the foundation. They're going to use terror, and they're going to actually ramp up terror pretty extensively in the next few decades as they rule. So they do lay the foundation for kind of this totalitarian state. So that is pretty problematic. This was called the Red Terror, by the way, and the Bolsheviks they did kind of consciously imitate the Jacobins. They knew they're like, well, we're not going to use guillotines. We're going to shoot people in basements, but same kind of situation here. So really the main way that they carried out this terror was through the use of the secret police. So they established a secret police force called the Cheka. They're mostly responsible for carrying out the terror. And again, they did it kind of in secret, unlike the French Revolution. And the Bolsheviks also took over this network of Tsarist labor camps called the Katorgas. So if you're like, oh, labor camps in Siberia, I've heard of that before. That's where this comes from. And I mentioned it's Tsarist labor camps, right? So the Bolsheviks themselves, a lot of them were kind of career revolutionaries. So they'd been exiled to these. And like, well, the Tsar put us in them. Why don't we put our enemies in them? And that's what they do. So estimates of the death toll of the terror really vary quite a lot because, again, a lot of it was done in secret and the Bolsheviks weren't really great at keeping records. So we think it's probably around 100,000 people. And one thing that I find interesting about this is it's a really good, or historians debate it, it's a really good continuity and change question here. So a lot of people are like, wait, so the Bolsheviks were using a secret police, they were using labor camps, the Tsar did that too. So to what extent was this terror an extension of earlier Tsarist repression? And I would say the straightforward answer to that is they did it worse, basically. The scale was a lot larger. So they basically combined sort of the tactics of Tsarist repression with the intensity of the repression during the French Revolution. So that's kind of this this horrible situation, two bad things merging into one worse thing. And another question that we're going to look at more next unit is, well, to what extent did this terror serve as the foundation for the Great Terror, which is another terror that was carried out by Lenin's successor in the 1930s, which is really one of the first totalitarian states. We'll be talking about what that means next unit.